The wind moves across a battlefield that should not exist. Broken Mongol standards lie face down in the mud. Horses wander riderless through a silence that feels wrong. Armor is split open, not cleanly pierced by arrows, not crushed by siege engines, torn. And the men who once made continents kneel are not advancing. They're pulling back, not in formation, not as a feigned retreat, but in something closer to disbelief. And that is the impossible part. For decades, this army had never truly lost. Cities across Persia burned in a single campaign season. Empires that stood for centuries collapsed in months. Kings who resisted vanished so completely that their names survived only as warnings. Under Genghis Khan, defeat was not a possibility. It wasn't even a word the empire understood. And yet here on a field far from the Mongol heartland, against an enemy that should have already been finished, something fractures. Not just a cavalry line, not just momentum, something structural. The kind of crack that doesn't kill a body immediately, but guarantees that it will fall. But here is where the story shifts. Because the battle that shattered Genghis Khan's empire may not be the one history points to. And the army standing across from the Mongols that day may not be the force that truly broke them. If this fracture happened here, then the Mongol Empire didn't fall the way you were told it did. And once you see the crack, you can't unsee it. Stay with me. Let's begin where you expect. Who could possibly defeat Genghis Khan? It seems like a ridiculous question. The man had engineered the most efficient killing apparatus the world had ever seen. And he hadn't built it from wealth or inherited power. He'd built it from nothing. In AD 1206, a man called Tujin, orphaned, exiled, left to starve on the Mongolian steppe as a child, united the warring Mongol tribes under a single banner. Not through diplomacy, through a calculus of violence, so precise it made loyalty the only rational choice. You followed him, or you were fed to the example he was making of someone else. And once the tribes were unified, the machine turned outward. Mongol warfare was not simply brutal. It was innovative in ways that most modern military historians still study with visible discomfort. Fignet retreats that lured cavalry into kill zones. Psychological operations that sent refugees flooding into the next city, carrying stories so horrifying that entire garrisons surrendered before a single arrow was loosed. Mobility that made traditional European and Islamic armies look like they were standing still because relative to the Mongols, they were between AD 1219 and AD 1221. The Khwarezmian Empire, one of the most powerful Islamic states in Central Asia, was dismantled so thoroughly that its cities still bear the scars. Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgent. Names that once meant civilization, reduced to ash in months, and the myth grew faster than the army itself. By the mid-1220s, the Mongol reputation preceded them by thousands of miles. Kingdoms that had never seen a Mongol rider already feared one. Rulers who had never lost a battle began calculating not whether to fight, but whether surrender would be accepted. That was the empire. That was the machine. Unstoppable, unquestioned, undefeated. So, here's where you expect the story to continue. More conquests, more expansion, an unbroken line of dominance stretching from the Pacific to the edges of Europe. But that's not what happened. There was a campaign that stalled. A battlefield far from the Mongol heartland where the usual arithmetic of terror did not produce the usual result. A decision made possibly by Genghis Khan himself that contradicts the ruthless caution that had defined every prior engagement. A year that historians still argue over, not because the sources disagree on what happened, but because certain sources refuse to mention it all. And that silence is the first fracture. When Mongol chronicles, written by court historians whose entire purpose was to glorify the Khan, suddenly go quiet about a specific engagement, that is not an oversight. That is a burial. Most people stop listening right here. That's why history keeps lying. So stay. Because the question you should be asking is not, did the Mongols lose? The question is, if the Mongols didn't lose here, why did everything change afterward? Now we start pulling at threads that most documentaries leave untouched. The likely candidate has a name, several names actually, because history can't agree on which battle matters most. And that disagreement is itself a kind of evidence. Consider the Battle of the Indus, AD 1221. Genghis Khan's forces have pursued Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu, the last surviving prince of the Khwarezmian dynasty, across the full breadth of what is now Afghanistan. Jalal ad-Din is not a king anymore. He commands no empire. He has no supply lines, no fortified cities, no diplomatic alliances left. He is by every strategic measure already finished. And yet at the banks of the Indus River, with mountains at his back and the most feared army on earth bearing down on him, Jalal ad-Din turns and fights. He should not survive this. The Mongols outnumber him. The Mongols outmaneuver everyone. The Mongols have not failed to destroy a cornered enemy in over a decade. But the engagement does not go as planned. Mongol sources, the ones that mention it, describe a tactical withdrawal, a repositioning, a strategic choice to allow Jalala to escape across the river rather than waste resources on a final engagement in difficult terrain. That is what the official record says. Now read the Persian accounts. The chroniclers of the Islamic world, writing in Arabic and Farsi, often decades later, but drawing on eyewitness testimony, described something different. A shock. Mongol units breaking formation. Commanders issuing contradictory orders. Casualties higher than expected, and a psychological rupture that rippled backward through the ranks in a way that had no precedent. Now, check the Chinese administrative records. After this period, the tone shifts. Not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself, but the language of Mongol governance in tax edicts, in military dispatches, in the careful bureaucratic documentation that the Yuan dynasty would later inherit changes. There is a new caution, a new emphasis on consolidation rather than expansion, as if someone, somewhere in the command structure, had quietly acknowledged a limit. 3 sets of sources, 3 different versions of the same event. And the contradictions between them are not accidental. They're the sound of an empire beginning to lie to itself. Now, add the human element. By the early 1220s, Genghis Khan's inner circle was no longer the lean, desperate coalition that had conquered the steppe. Commanders who had earned their positions through brilliance and brutality were aging. Younger generals, many of them the Khan's own sons, were jockeying for authority with the kind of rivalry that the old Temujin would have crushed immediately. But Temujin was aging too. Supplies stretched across a campaign theater that now spanned from Korea to the Caspian Sea were thinning. Not collapsing, thinning. The kind of slow resource bleed that doesn't show up in battle reports, but shows up in delayed reinforcements, in garrisons undermanned by 10%. In horses ridden, one campaign, too many. And beneath all of it, a question that no one in the Mongol court dared to speak aloud, but that every commander was already calculating around what happens when the Khan dies. Not if, when, because the empire had no mechanism for peaceful succession. It had Genghis Khan, and Genghis Khan had sons who hated each other. So ask yourself, not as a student of history, but as a human being who understands how power works. What if the empire didn't shatter from outside pressure? What if a single battle, one engagement, where the impossible arithmetic of Mongol dominance failed to produce the expected result, simply revealed a crack that was already there? The danger was never the defeat itself. The danger was the illusion that the empire was still unbreakable. So, let's answer the question you've been holding. Did Genghis Khan actually lose? Here is the most accepted interpretation among modern historians, the version you'll find in most textbooks, the one that sounds clean enough to be comfortable. No, not really. The Mongols recovered from every setback. After the Indies engagement, Genghis Khan consolidated his forces, reorganized his command structure, and continued campaigns that would expand the empire further. After his death in AD 1227, his successors pushed into Eastern Europe, into the Middle East, into Southeast Asia. The empire did not simply survive, it grew. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. More territory than Rome, more territory than Alexander ever dreamed of. A domain so vast that a letter sent from one end might not reach the other before the season changed. So the myth survives, the great undefeated machine rolled on. The brief stumble at the Indies, or wherever you placed the fracture, was corrected. The empire adapted. The empire expanded. The story continues. Take a breath. Feel that relief. The narrative makes sense again. Now, let me take it away from you. Because here is what happened in the years immediately following that battle. The details that the clean version omits. Campaign tempo changed. Not everywhere, not all at once, but the relentless, almost mechanical pace of Mongol expansion. The pace that had devoured the Khorasan Empire in 2 years slowed. In certain regions, it didn't just slow, it stopped. Expansion in India, the logical next target after the Indies campaign, was effectively abandoned. Not formally, not announced, simply not pursued. The subcontinent, which should have fallen within a decade, remained unconquered. This is not explained by any military obstacle. India had no army that could match the Mongols. It is explained by something else, something internal. Succession tensions intensified. Genghis Khan's sons, Jaki, Chagatai, Ogedei, Tului had always competed. But after this period, the competition became structural. Territory was divided not as military strategy, but as political appeasement. Commands were split. Loyalties were partitioned. The unified war machine began operating as several smaller machines, each answering to a different ambition. Regional commanders gained autonomy they had never held before. Generals who once executed the Khan's orders without question began making independent decisions about when to advance, when to withdraw, when to negotiate. Not because they were disobedient, because the center was no longer strong enough to enforce obedience in real time across the breadth of the empire. The Mongol war machine did not collapse. It decentralized. And if you understand anything about how empires die, anything at all, you know that decentralization is not recovery. Decentralization is the first stage of fracture. It is the point where an empire begins to die while still believing it is expanding. But I'm not going to explain that fully yet, because the question you need to sit with is this. If the empire kept growing, if it kept conquering, kept expanding, kept projecting the image of invincibility for decades after this battle, how could this single engagement still be the one that shattered it? Hold that contradiction. Don't resolve it. The answer has been in front of you the entire time. You just haven't been allowed to see it clearly until now. The battle didn't destroy the Mongol army. It didn't shatter their formations. It didn't break their supply lines. It didn't kill enough soldiers to make a material difference to an empire that could conscript replacements from a dozen conquered nations. What it shattered was the myth. And you need to understand, truly understand, in a way that changes how you see every empire that has ever existed, what that means. The Mongol Empire was not held together by military superiority alone. Military superiority was the mechanism, but the binding agent, the force that kept tributary states submissive, that kept conquered populations compliant, that kept rival kingdoms from testing their luck, was fear. Not fear of a specific army. Fear of an idea. The idea that resistance was mathematically futile, that the Mongols could not be beaten, that any city that closed its gates would be reduced to rubble, and any city that opened them might be allowed to survive. The terror was not in what the Mongols did. It was in what everyone believed the Mongols could do. The gap between those two things, between reality and reputation, was the empire's most powerful weapon. And at the Indies, or at whatever engagement you place at the fulcrum of this shift, that weapon cracked, not visibly, not immediately. The crack was hairline, a rumor, a story told by a survivor who shouldn't have survived. A report from a Persian merchant who passed through a garrison town and noticed something he couldn't quite name. A hesitation in the eyes of Mongol soldiers that hadn't been there before. But cracks and myths do not heal. They spread slowly along trade routes. In the whispered conversations between diplomats who were calculating, always calculating the cost of continued submission in the private councils of kings who had surrendered without fighting and now wondered for the first time whether that had been necessary. The first whispers of Mongol vulnerability began moving across Eurasia like a slow infection. In the Caucasus, tributary states that had paid tribute without question for a decade began delaying payments. Not refusing, delaying testing. In Persia, local administrators who had governed on behalf of the Mongols began building private alliances with regional warlords. Not rebellion, insurance. In the Western Steppe, Kipchak and Kuman chieftains, peoples who had fled from the Mongol advance, began drifting back toward their former territories, not attacking, watching, and within the empire itself, within the command, tents, and the war councils, and the careful hierarchy that Genghis Khan had built on the understanding that his word was absolute, generals began doing something they had never done before. They began calculating loyalty, not feeling it, calculating it. Which son of the Khan would likely inherit? Which faction would control the succession? Which alliance would be profitable? And which would be fatal? These were not the questions of men who served an invincible empire. These were the questions of men who had glimpsed an ending. Genghis Khan died in AD 1227. The official cause varies depending on which source you trust. A fall from a horse, an illness, a wound received in battle, an assassination. The disagreement itself tells you something. An empire that cannot agree on how its founder died is an empire that has already begun the process of mythologizing its own collapse. But the timing is what matters. He died less than 6 years after the battle at the Indies. Less than 6 years after the first hairline crack in the myth. And in those 6 years, he had not managed to do the one thing that might have saved the empire. He had not solved the succession. Oh, he had named an heir Ogdai, the compromised choice, not the eldest, not the most capable, the one least likely to provoke immediate civil war among his brothers. A choice made not from strength, but from the calculus of managed decline. And the moment Genghis Khan's body was carried back to Mongolia, the moment the great unifying force was removed, the crack became a canyon. Not immediately, not in a way that the empire's enemies could exploit right away, but the machinery of fracture was now irreversible. Ogedai drank heavily, constantly. He expanded the empire into Russia, into Poland, into Hungary. But he expanded it the way a man spends an inheritance without the discipline that had earned it, without the strategic patience that had made each campaign self-sustaining, and beneath Ojah, the sons and grandsons of Genghis Khan began the slow, poisonous work of turning an empire into a family argument. Joy's line claimed the Western territories. Chaghatay's line claimed Central Asia. Talo's descendants, who would eventually produce both Kublai Khan and Hulagu claimed the richest prizes China and Persia. Each branch remembered being Mongol. None of them remembered being unified. The worst part, the part that should make you uncomfortable, was not that the Mongols bled on a battlefield by the Indus River. The worst part was that the world saw them bleed. And once the world saw it, once the idea of Mongol invincibility was punctured by even a single ambiguous, arguable example of failure, the fear began to drain. Not like a dam breaking, like a slow leak in a vessel that no one can find. If stories like this disappear, they don't stay buried. They repeat. And here, right here, is where I refuse to give you resolution. Because the question you need now is not what happened at the Indies. The question is, if this battle fractured the illusion, what finished the empire? What finished the empire was time. And that is the most terrifying answer history can give you, because it means no one had to do anything. The fracture simply had to exist, and time, patient, indifferent, unopposable, did the rest. Here is what the next century looked like told without the comfort of narrative structure. Because what happened doesn't deserve structure. It deserves witness. AD 1241. Genghis Khan dies. He is drunk or ill or both. The sources cannot agree. And by this point, the sources have stopped trying to agree on anything. His death triggers the first succession crisis. Not because there is no heir, but because every faction believes it has the rightful one. The Mongol armies in Europe, which have just devastated Poland and Hungary, which are within striking distance of Vienna and the heart of Western Christendom, receive the recall order. They turn around, not because they were defeated, not because Europe had found a way to resist, because the princes and generals commanding those armies needed to return to Mongolia to participate in the political contest that would determine the next Khan. Europe was saved not by European strength, but by Mongol dysfunction. Let that settle for a moment. The survival of Western European civilization as a political entity may owe more to Mongol succession disputes than to any army, any fortress, any act of resistance that Europeans can claim. AD 1251. After a decade of political maneuvering, Monk Kun, grandson of Genghis through the Tali line, takes the throne. He is competent. He is ruthless. He attempts to restore the unified vision. It doesn't work because the empire is no longer one thing. It is four things pretending to be one thing. The Golden Horde in Russia and Eastern Europe. The Chagatai Khaganate in Central Asia. The Ilkhanate forming in Persia and the Middle East. The Yuan dynasty taking shape in China. They share a bloodline. They share a founding mythology. They share almost nothing else. The Golden Horde converts to Islam. The Ilkhanate converts to Islam, but a different political expression of it. The Yuan dynasty adopts Chinese bureaucratic traditions. The Chagatai Khaganate fragments into sedentary and nomadic factions that despise each other. Each Khaganate develops its own administrative language, its own tax system, its own diplomatic relationships with non-Mongol powers, its own definition of what it means to be Mongol. This is not collapse. This is something worse. This is an identity dissolving while the name remains. AD 1260, the Battle of Agilit. And here's where most documentaries would place the shattering. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt meets a Mongol army in the Jezreel Valley of modern-day Israel. And the Mamluks win. It is the first unambiguous, undeniable, militarily decisive defeat of a Mongol army in open battle. And it matters. It matters enormously because Iron Jalot does something that the Battle of the Indies only hinted at. It proves the myth is dead. Not dying. Dead. After a Jalut, the Mongol advance into the Middle East stops permanently. The Ilkhanate consolidates. It does not expand. The psychological weapon that had conquered half of Eurasia The belief that resistance was futile is gone. But here's what you need to understand, and what most histories get exactly wrong. Einat did not shatter the empire. Einat was the moment the world confirmed what it had suspected for 40 years. The shattering had already happened at the Indies in the succession crisis and the slow, silent decentralization that turned one empire into 4 resentful fragments. And Jalit was not the cause. It was the autopsy. The decades that follow are not a story of dramatic collapse. They are a story of slow, grinding dissolution, which is worse to watch and worse to live through than any single catastrophe. The Golden Horde wars with the Ilkhanate. Mongol fights Mongol. The descendants of Genghis Khan shed each other's blood over territory that their grandfather would have considered a single province. The Chagatai Khanate splits into eastern and western halves. Then the halves split again. Local warlords, many of them Turkic, many of them Muslim, few of them loyal to any Mongol identity, fill the power vacuums. The Yuan dynasty in China maintains the most coherent Mongol governance, but it does so by becoming Chinese. Kublai Khan builds his capital at what is now Beijing. He adopts Chinese court rituals. He employs Chinese administrators. He funds Chinese art and Chinese infrastructure. And in doing so, he creates something magnificent and something that is Mongol in name only. By AD 1368, the Yuan dynasty falls to the Ming Rebellion. The Mongols are driven back to the steppe. In China, an empire that had ruled for barely a century is remembered not as Mongol governance, but as foreign occupation. In Persia, the Ilkhanate collapses into successor states by the 1350s. In Russia, the Golden Horde fragments into the Khanate of Kazan, the Khanate of Crimea, the Khanate of Astran, smaller and smaller pieces of a thing that once stretched from Korea to Hungary. The empire didn't explode. It dissolved the way salt dissolves in water, slowly, completely, until you cannot find the original substance, no matter how carefully you look. And the question you should be asking, the one that will not leave you comfortable, is this. Who benefited? Regional elites, rival chaos, local administrators who had served the Mongols faithfully until faithfulness stopped being profitable. The merchants and bureaucrats and minor nobles who inherited fragments of the system and built their own petty kingdoms from the rubble. They benefited. Who was forgotten? The original vision. The Mongol unity under Temujin. The idea, however brutal, its execution, that the steppe peoples could build something that rivaled any civilization on Earth. That was forgotten. Not destroyed, forgotten. Which is worse. History remembers conquests. It rarely remembers the moment fear stopped working. And once fear stopped working, once the myth cracked at the Indies and shattered at Ian Jalut and dissolved into a century of fratricidal decline, cohesion died with it. Not because the Mongols were weak, because the thing that had made them strong was never real. It was belief. And belief, once broken, does not return. You've been watching a story about the 13th century, but you haven't been watching a story about the 13th century. Every empire that has ever existed, every system of power that has projected dominance across populations too large to control through force alone has relied on the same architecture the Mongols built. Reputation, myth, the psychological certainty held by the governed that resistance is not merely dangerous but pointless. It is the most efficient form of control ever devised. Cheaper than armies, more durable than walls, more persuasive than any ideology until it fails. And it always fails the same way. Not in a catastrophic battle, not in a dramatic revolution, not in the moment the history books remember. It fails in the moment someone sees the empire bleed and thinks, oh, they're mortal. That thought, quite private, almost invisible, is the most dangerous force in human history. More dangerous than any army because once it exists, it cannot be unthought. It spreads through populations like a contagion that no quarantine can contain. It moves along trade routes and through diplomatic channels and across dinner tables where men and women who have spent their entire lives in submission suddenly look at each other and ask, "What if we didn't have to?" The Mongol Empire was not destroyed by the Mamluks at Angelut. It was not destroyed by the Ming Dynasty in China. It was not destroyed by any external force. It was destroyed by a hairline crack in a myth, a crack that appeared on a riverbank in AD 1221, and by the 40 years of slow, invisible erosion that followed. The empire fell because it believed its own story. And when the story was disproven, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly in a single battle that the court chroniclers tried to bury, there was nothing underneath it. No institutional loyalty, no shared identity beyond conquest, no mechanism for survival that did not depend on the absolute unquestioned certainty that the Mongols could not be stopped. Take that certainty away and what remains is not an empire. It is a collection of armed men who remember being powerful, and that memory fades. There's a line sometimes attributed to Mongol chroniclers, though its exact origin remains disputed. The kind of line that survives because it cuts too deep to be forgotten. An empire founded by war must maintain itself by war. And when it can no longer maintain the belief in war, it maintains nothing. Sit with that, not as a lesson about the Mongols, as a question about every system of power you have ever lived inside. Was this battle the cause of what happened to the Mongol Empire? Or was it just the first visible symptom of something that was already rotting? Something that every empire carries inside itself from the moment of its founding, like a flaw in the metal that only reveals itself under pressure. I don't have an answer for you. History doesn't have an answer for you. And anyone who tells you they do is selling the same myth the Mongols sold. You've just witnessed a truth history try to silence. If that matters to you, subscribe to the Forgotten Tortures and don't let it stay silent.